Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Добар ден на сите, почитувани гости, почитувани посетители на десеттиот вебинар со доктор Џеки Ештон Смит. Еве доаѓа време за повторно дружење со сите вас. Имаше 176 пријавени гости, сега веројатно доцни и тоа е голем проблем. Но се надевам дека имаме извонредно предавање денеска од колешката која што ни доаѓа овој пат од Лондон. Ќе ми дозволите секако да го споделам нејзината кратка биографија и сега ќе продолжам на англиски заради неа се разбира. А за време на предавањето ќе имате во четот од секој слайд, се надевам дека имате сите пристап до четот, ќе имате keynotes или забелешки од секој слайд. На крајот, со кревање на рака, доколку сакате директно да поставите прашање со камера и микрофон, или пак во четот може да го поставите прашањето. Сепак ние преферираме директно во живо за да биде поголема интерактивност. Okay, dear ladies and gentlemen, I will go now on English. Let me to introduce you Dr. Џеки Ештон Смит from London, UK. Today we will have another opportunity to hear one interesting presentation from her. But first of all, let me share with you her very good short CV and to introduce herself to you. Dr. Џеки Ештон Smith is an experienced educationalist and trainer with 40 years of experience in the field of autism, education and leadership. Her postgraduate qualifications include a doctorate in education, Master of Business Administration and postgraduate diploma in specialized education, autism and special educational needs. Her autism and education experience ranges from specialist teaching to principalships and education operations management to developing and opening specialist school and education directorships in the National Autistic Society, UK. She is currently an associate consultant for A-T Autizam and independent consultant in the UK, and also develops and delivers training modules and works on EU projects for ShipCon from Cyprus, a leading EU training provider. She also delivers training at a range of universities in the UK and EU, has delivered a wide range of training internationally, including Japan, Middle East, USA, and Mexico, and has presented at major conferences worldwide, including a member of Autism World Conferences and Autism Europe Conferences. She is a member of a range of professional bodies, including Autism Accreditation, COSPA, the National Association of Special Schools, BELMAS, British Educational Leadership Management and Administration Society, and Pathological Avoidance Syndrome Research Group. Her special interests are the identification and education of girls and women on the autism spectrum, neurodiversity and leadership. Her publication include Miss or Misdiagnosis, Girls and Women on the Autism Spectrum, which will be the topic of today's webinar. Ashton Smith, Judy Good, and mutual attraction. How do we identify, recruit, and retain the right people to work with people on the autism spectrum? This is a very short biography of her. And you will have now you can see that she is very experienced in this field. Now I will ask her to start with sharing her presentation. I hope that now she can share. We know each other since last month, but we have very intensive email communication, and I hope that all of you will be satisfied with today's her lecture. Welcome, Џеки.
Thanks, Vladimir. If you can click on the arrow so I can upload my presentation, that would be great.
Yes, but now you have to share as we.
Yes.
If I share, you cannot share in the same time.
It just says only meeting organizers and presenters can share. So you need to click on that and then I can share mine like last time. Thank you.
Yeah. I will try now to do that.
Thank you.
But probably now it will be not possible. I don't know why, but you're in the meeting. I gave you permission 1 hour before, but I don't know why. For every case, I will share in that. If you cannot,
okay.
Just a second. I'm excusing to the audience. Excuse myself. I don't know why you're not available to share your presentation.
Very strange.
Yes. When we check.
Yeah, it worked perfectly.
Yeah, 1 hour and a half. It works perfectly. Yes, but now.
Should I just come in again, Vladimir? Maybe that would help.
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, if you don't have in mind, I will do for that for you. And here it is. Just remind me when to go on the next slide.
That's fine. That's fine. We can manage like that, Vladimir, if it's okay with you.
Yeah, it's okay. In that case, I will not go in the background, but my colleagues will help me with some with the chat and with some other things from MSSA. Okay, let's go with your presentation. This is your second slide.
Thanks very much, Vladimir. Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, just to reiterate that it's lovely to be here. I'm not a clinician and I'm not a diagnostician. I'm an educationist, as you know, but I've been very, very lucky to have done a lot of work and with my colleague and friend, Dr. Judith Gould. And a lot of this presentation I've done with her and have learned from her. So hopefully we'll get through that today. If I speak too fast, I'm going to ask Vladimir to give me a shout because I tend to speak quite fast. So what I'm going to speak about this morning is issues with the identification and the diagnosis of girls and women on the autism spectrum. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the anecdotal things, the differences we see on a daily basis as teachers, as parents, as practitioners. And then I'll look at general diagnostic criteria and the differences we see in the female presentation of autism. And I'll go into detail about the female presentation in greater detail. We're going to look at the identification and the diagnosis of girls and women. And we'll look at the potential implications of the lack of identification or diagnosis on their social interaction, their emotions, and their educational opportunities and inclusion in society, including getting jobs, getting married, living the life that you and I live. And finally, I'll look at the types of diagnostic tools available and the importance of diagnosis in education. Okay, next slide. So as we know, many girls on the autism spectrum are not being identified and diagnosed. And when I started working on this 12, 15 years ago, we identified it as a problem then. And it's horrible, the fact that now 12, 15 years later, this is still happening. And Gilbert said in 2010 that without the skills of an experienced clinician, the diagnostic criteria used may not pick up girls. And he thought, well, let's have an idea of what is exactly happening. And he said, you know, when we look at autism and learning difficulties, we usually have a ratio of around about 4 boys to 1 girl. But he reckons it should only be 1.5 boys to 1 girl if the diagnostic criteria were correct. And autism with no intellectual impairments at all. Now, this is where it's more dangerous, actually, is we're talking about 12 boys to 1 girl, but it should only be 4 boys to 1 girl. So all of these girls are going through life undiagnosed and unidentified. So why is this happening? What are the symptomatic differences in girls and boys? So let's have a look at a few that I think are really, really interesting. The third one, a deviant style of gaze. 50% of girls demonstrate that at a very young age and only 30% of boys. But this isn't picked up because people seem to think that girls should be more shy. Lacks a best friend. Only 30% of girls don't think they have a best friend, whereas 70% of boys say that. Now, whether the girls actually have a best friend or not is up for debate, but only 30% of girls say that. And following other children like a shadow, 40% of girls do that. So those 2 things you're looking at regarding a best friend and following other children shows social instinct. And finally, a massive one is 65% of girls show demand avoidance. And that is a big thing in the way they deal with their lives. Thank you. So why are these girls not being identified at school? Well, often they have passive personalities and they're compliant, so they don't come across as having social difficulties. They might be shy, coy, embarrassed, and people assume this is why they avoid eye contact. And being girls, it's not seen as being different. They're not as disruptive as boys tend to be, so they camouflage their difficulties, and we'll talk about that later. And they tend to become passive-aggressive. They suffer in silence. They squash it all in. They appease and they apologize. And if there are any parents there today, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, because these little girls will be perfect little girls at school. But when they come home, they let off steam. And it's their parents who really see the difficulties these girls are going through. Okay? Boys' disruptive behavior is more common, and we'll see boys' behavior often has a different purpose. For example, to gain an object, whereas girls want to gain attention from each other. Now, I know this is very generalized, okay? But this is generally what we find, is that girls, once again, will show the social need. The girls are more able to play socially, and they have better visual reception, non-verbal skills than boys. And they follow social actions by delayed imitation. And that is a big thing, is the way girls imitate other children to appear as coming across as typical. And they mask features of their autism, which is why it's so important for us to know more about the way these girls present. Thank you. In Kopp's book, there's a woman who works quite comprehensively with girls on the autism spectrum, and she put forward this teacher's checklist, which is just to help teachers in schools to maybe pick up that a child may be on the autism spectrum, because, as I say, these girls are difficult to pick up. The special interests I'll raise, the special interests that girls have, which we'll talk about later, are not very unusual, but the intensity of those interests are unusual. They will also be isolated. They'll be viewed slightly odd by teachers, perhaps. Maybe they've got lack of empathy. Maybe they question all the time. But this little list may be able to help teachers pick up the early signs that a girl might be on the autism spectrum. Thank you. So let's look at girls' special interests. Boys generally tend to be hyperactive and more aggressive, and they have interests in technical hobbies and facts. We all know boys that collect things like stick insects or really strange things perhaps to us. But the girls seem to have the same interests as other girls of their age. For example, animals, horses, classic literature. They tend to collect information about people rather than things. They love things like Shakespeare, celebrities, soap operas, all the things that often other girls will do, but it's the intensity of those interests that makes the difference. And that, as teachers, we need to listen to parents, because it's parents who will tell us about the intensity of some of these interests. And this is a key thing to pick up. Okay, next slide. They also tend to escape into fiction, the girls. They have imaginary friends. They live in another world with fairies and witches. Now, we talk about imagination and you think, hang on, Jackie, what are you saying here? We know children on the autism spectrum have difficulties with so-called imagination. Well, now you can see there's a lie to that. This type of imaginative activity is very common in girls. They will often demonstrate very nice pretend play. They'll compile books of people's names, the color of their hair. They are very, very socially orientated in terms of on the spectrum, okay? Socially orientated for an autistic person. And girls' obsessional interests are often centered about relationships and people. When we talk about pretend play, we'll talk about later about the way that they can actually bluff or confuse clinicians due to their pretend play. Next slide. So let's look now at social communication. Girls tend to use new words as soon as they learn them, as opposed to boys, and they often have superior linguistic abilities compared to boys of the same cognitive level. So we found that girls that present with more subtle autism behaviors, because they're on the higher end of the spectrum, are often able to answer questions about social situations, social communication, and friendships that boys at the same level of functioning may not be able to do. And they are able to keep up until they get to their teenage years. And this is where the girls start having problems, because they find it very difficult to keep up with chatty teenage girls. And this is where you'll start seeing the difference and really seeing the fact that these children do have social communication difficulties. But up to the age of about 10 or 11, they manage to hide it pretty well. Thank you. In terms of social understanding, girls with higher IQ, especially verbal girls, are able to mask or compensate for their condition. We find across the board they are much more socially immature and reticent than their non-autistic peers. And their communication difficulties, as I say, become more obvious in secondary school. Thank you. In primary school, girls are more likely to get mothered by other girls and supported and included by peers, as opposed to being bullied. So boys will often get bullied even in primary school, but girls tend to get looked after. And we often laugh and say that the girls who tend to look after and mother the autistic girls at school will be the special ed teachers of the future. Girls tend to be passive and present as shy. They're the outsiders, they can't mix well, they avoid other children, and they tend to stay on the edge of the group. And other girls help them, so teachers don't realize there's a problem. And boys are not as socially inclined, and many have no friends, but girls, many have one very special friend, and that one special friend can make a huge difference to a young autistic girl's life. Thank you. In terms of social understanding, Many girls want to connect with people outside their families. Many girls care about what their peers think, and they worry about it. Now, this is where you start seeing a big difference. They imitate other girls in order to initiate social contact, but they can't hold reciprocal friendships, which is distressing. So it's that communication between the two that they find difficult. A monologue or talking by themselves, they find easy, but a conversation is difficult. Some girls are not good at empathy and they lock themselves out, whereas other girls tend to overemphasize. So they can't disassociate themselves from other people's grief, anger, anxiety, or joy. So you see these two extremes, and this you don't find in that many boys. Next slide. In terms of social understanding, their social skills development is different. The girls are more motivated to learn and quicker to understand key concepts. They demonstrate a form of social echolalia. So what do I mean by that? What we find is that girls tend to copy other girls. Girls tend to study other girls and copy them. They almost have social echolalia in the way that they talk. They'll speak in their friend's language, in their friend's tone of voice, and they will mirror others. And therefore, it looks as though they have social competence, but it's actually very, very superficial. It's not deep. And this is why we find girls are more likely to get enrolled in things like speech and drama lessons, acting, etc., because this is the way they learn to be typical. And there are a number of books that are written about this. So Leanne Halliday Willie talks about pretending to be normal. That's the name of her book. She talks about how she copies other people and almost becomes that other person. And we'll talk about her later. Thank you. Friends. This is really interesting. I've met some girls that have 1 or 2 or 3 imaginary friends, and each one of those friends has a little different voice and a different personality. They will also tend to show elaborate play with dolls. And when they're indulging in solitary play, it'll look as though it is spontaneous, but actually they have a little script in their heads, and they will often play exactly the same way time after time after time. Or they'll reproduce a real event or a scene from a book. So for example, if you're a diagnostician and you're looking at a young child and you say that girl is showing imaginative play, but actually what that girl could be doing is acting out something she saw on television the night before. And for a clinician needs to know what children are watching to be able to pick up that type of thing. In terms of playing with another child, they will often be too controlling. They will decide what the dolls are going to do, how the dolls are going to do it, and they will dominate the play. So it's not the type of play that you would usually see between 2 girls. Thank you. So I've mentioned the sort of things that we see in school, and why is this so important? That we pick these things up, that we know about them. And the reason it's important is because large numbers of unidentified or undiagnosed girls are going through our education system right across Europe. And the problems they encounter because of lack of identification is lack of appropriate support and lack of appropriately trained teachers who are able to pick up these children. And what does that end up with? These young people become socially isolated, lonely, depressed, it has a negative impact on their education. They become very confused as people. And it reduces their future prognosis and opportunities. And one of the things we've been doing quite a lot of work about is the opportunities denied to women on the autism spectrum as adults. And there's a lovely woman called Postgate, and she says that she really believes that if she'd been given the opportunity and identified when she was young, her life would have been different. She said, at school I was bright but eccentric. If I had been a boy, I would have been tolerated more. I'd probably have gone into science. I might have gone on to be a nuclear physicist. But as she says, as a girl, I wasn't picked up. And therefore, I've never had a career. Now, Postgate is probably the same age as me, and things have changed a lot since then, thank goodness. So let's hope that doesn't happen to other girls. Thank you. So let's now look at not what we see as teachers, what we see as parents. Let's look at the criteria for formal diagnosis. Autism is a syndrome, and it occurs on a spectrum. A syndrome refers to a group of symptoms which occur simultaneously to form an unidentifiable condition. And our knowledge of syndromes is based on experience and in many cases, observations. It was referred to as the triad of impairments. Thank you. And that was not meant to be derogatory at all. The word impairment was meant not in a derogatory way, but to actually demonstrate that there's support and needs. So what do we look at as diagnosticians? We look at social interaction, social communication, social imagination, and specialized interests and routines. And you all know this. You know this backwards. I'm going to go through this quickly. And in terms of the DSM-5, the key things in order to reach the diagnostic work functioning because of these difficulties. Thank you. So historically, there's been a strong gender bias of more males than females because we know autism presents differently in females. As a result, professionals are less likely to identify or diagnose girls. And in a study in 2011 with Judith Gould and myself, suggests that the imbalance between autistic males and females is due to missed autism spectrum diagnosis. There will still be more of a swing towards male prevalence, but not to the extent. And what we find at the NAS Lorna Wing Diagnostic Centre, where Judith Gould works, increasing number of women and girls are being referred for diagnosis through mental health services. And that shows you what the impact is of a lack of diagnosis on girls and women. Thank you. So just to reiterate, the core features identified in autism are the same in males and females, and neither women or men consistently conform to the stereotype. As Lorna Wing said, they never read the manual, and nature never draws a straight line. But females are less likely to meet the current diagnostic criteria because they often show the social interest out of keeping with the autism stereotype. And what we have found anecdotally, and there's no scientific back for this, I'm just saying something that we've sort of noticed over the years, is that girls that get diagnosed on the autism spectrum when they're young often present in the typical way. Girls who only get diagnosed much later present in the female way. And we'll often find that boys who present in the female way, which is more sociable, will often also get diagnosed late. Thank you. So here are some of my wonderful colleagues on the autism spectrum. So instead of detecting the signs that they display as young people as part of the autism spectrum, doctors frequently mistake them for emotional disorders. And speaking so often to women on the autism spectrum, and as adults, they will say this is a massive problem, that they only got a diagnosis later on because it was seen that they had emotional and behavioral disorders as opposed to being on the autism spectrum. Except for Temple Grandin, who obviously got diagnosed quite young. Thank you. So what are clinicians looking for when diagnosing autism in females? All people on the autism spectrum have core difficulties, and we know that, but girls and women display certain differences. Okay, let's go through those in detail. Social interaction. This is a massive one. They are far more socially interested and aware than boys. And in one of the areas of the United Kingdom, one of our nations, I've had a lot of correspondence with mothers of girls on the autism spectrum who say that clinicians are refusing to diagnose their daughter as being on the autism spectrum because they show difficulties with social communication and social understanding, but their social interaction appears absolutely fine. Now, you and I know that these girls are brilliant at copying other people. They're brilliant at learning how to mask their autism, and therefore they are confusing a lot of diagnosticians. And that's understandable, because this is not something that people are getting taught at universities generally. The other thing we find is that in terms of social communication, they have superior superficial language ability. Now, when we talk about masking later on, one of the things they manage to use in masking is language. They have a set of stock phrases that they will use to give themselves thinking time. They have a set of stock phrases that they will use to get through difficult social situations. So once again, they are managing to confuse the rest of us. I have huge, absolutely massive respect for girls and women on the autism spectrum, because my goodness, they have really learned to cope with very difficult circumstances in such an amazing way. In terms of social imagination, greater pretend play and use of their imagination. Once again, they will confuse people. Interestingly enough, just as an aside, have you noticed that the majority of books, or a large majority of books, written about the experiences of having autism are actually written by females? That just shows you this interest they have in social communication, social imagination, social interaction, and being able to share their experiences. And finally, the special interests and routines. We know that their interests are mainstream, but the intensity is different. And this is why masking is such a big issue in terms of females and autism. Thank you. So let's look at the diagnosis of social communication. Let's look down number 3. We're now starting to look at the impact society has on the way autistic people behave. In society generally, females are expected to be social in their communication. But what we do notice with our girls on the autism spectrum is that they tend not to do social chit-chat or make meaningless comments to facilitate social communication like the rest of us. We'll all say, "Hi, how are you? Are you fine?" We don't really want an answer, but we tend to do that sort of thing, especially in England. We are very polite. We use lots of words and say very little at times. I don't know what it's like in North Macedonia, but I do know that is how we are in the United Kingdom, whereas girls on the autism spectrum can't be bothered with that nonsense. They also tend not to talk about emotions or partake in typical intense talk that teenage girls get involved in. And this makes them outsiders again. Those of us who have teenage daughters know they can talk for hours with their friends on the telephone about emotions and how they feel, etc. Girls on the autism spectrum often don't want to do that. They just want to talk about facts, the things that interest them. They also have little idea of social hierarchy. That's the difference in how to communicate with people of a different age or status. They will treat everybody the same way. So you might be the principal of a school, and they will walk in and they will talk to you the same way as they might do one of their friends. So the idea of social hierarchy is not there. And they will often have difficulty picking up the subtleties of girl talk, and therefore they're often ridiculed, bullied, or manipulated. Girls can be really nasty when they're teenagers. So this has an effect on their social interaction. In terms of social interaction, we've covered this. They observe and copy others, but they do feel the aware of and the need to interact socially. They want to do it. They want to conform. They want to identify with peers. And because they find this difficult and they often get rejected, they find it easier to interact with adults rather than their peers. Girls are often over-eager and intense, and this can lead to social rejection. And what we find is they will often get rejected by other girls their age because they come across as too intense, too needy, and they don't have the idea that more than one person can be a friend at the same time. And we'll talk a little bit about that just now. Thank you. When involved in social interaction, they are often the children who are led on by their peers rather than those who are making the initial contact. So they are the followers. They are passive. Parents will often engineer or organize friendships for their daughters. And this we find so often is that a girl will say, "Oh, I have lots of friends." And actually, when you analyze that, it's because the friends have been set up by their wonderful parents who know that they want to have friends, who feel sorry for them and organize friendships, organize play dates, etc. But as we said earlier, females often have one special friend. And to enable them to keep that friend is a difficulty. And to do this, they will often engage in camouflage and masking. Thank you. There's a very, very good book that came out this year, written by Sedgwick, and I would highly recommend that you look at this if you're interested in getting into more detail of the presentation of girls and women on the autism spectrum. When people feel they have to compensate for their autism characteristics, they have to invest a lot of time and energy in trying to pass as neurotypical, according to Sedgwick. And this book is written by a group of people who are and are not autistic. It's a mixed group of people. And they say, these are typical things that we find in girls and women. They might learn social cues from various forms of media, from what they watch on television, from you little scientists learning how to be social. They learn to adjust their voice to match other people's voice patterns. And equipped with these observations and skills, they then use them in social situations to varying effects. That is a very, very complicated thing to do. And this is what these women and girls are learning and studying and focusing on a daily basis. Thank you. There are two types of masking that we look at. The one is camouflaging. These are the girls who hide in the background in the hope that they're not being noticed. So if nobody notices me, nobody's going to put pressure on me. And right in the beginning, we talked about these girls who are demand avoidant. This camouflaging is all part of that. And masking is then used when camouflaging is not possible. And it's a strategy to avoid being seen as different or struggling in a situation. So why are people masking? Why are women and girls doing this? There are a number of reasons. The one is to feel safe and avoid stigma, to avoid mistreatment or bullying, or to succeed at work, to attract a romantic partner, or to make friends. Anything that helps them fit in or feel a sense of belonging, because these girls want to be part of society, want to be part of a group, want to belong, and they find it very difficult. And this is one of the strategies that they have learned in order to achieve that. Thank you. But there's an implication to masking. And I talked about Leanne Holiday-Willie in her book, Pretending to be Normal. She says that actually, sometimes it's dangerous because you lose yourself. You sometimes lose your sense of identity because, she says, I was an avid observer. I was enthralled by the nuances of people's actions. In fact, I found it desirable to become the other person. So I copied their looks, their actions. She copies their vocal inflections, their facial expressions, their hand movements, and their tiny gestures. And she says, it was if I became the person I was emulating. Now that in itself is very profound. I have met Leanne, and in talking to her, Leanne is American, and I'm British. And by the end of a 5-minute conversation, Leanne spoke exactly like me. But the difficulty with this masking and the ability to do that is people like Leanne often lose their sense of identity, of who they are, and that is not good for their mental well-being. Thank you. So the long-term effect is anxiety, it could be depression, it could be exhaustion, it could be loss of identity, as we said, and sadly, it could also lead to suicidal thoughts. People who camouflage regularly often say they feel drained and exhausted by the effort of trying to conform to the so-called neurotypical standards of behavior. And the parents who are here today will know this all the time, because once, as I said, these girls manage to hold it together when they're at school. They hold it together when they're out with their friends, but when they come home, they are so exhausted, they often lose it when they get home. And it's the parents who are there helping their young people pull themselves together after a very difficult day. Thank you. And finally, we'll look at social imagination. Social imagination, as we know, does not only relate to pretense or symbolic activities, it's the ability to use imagination in a social sense. And imaginative activities in childhood are the precursors of the ability to predict a range of possible consequences arising from past and present events. And this is where pretend play, playing with your peers, playing sport, all of these sort of things help you learn how to deal with issues when you're young. But one of the big things that we find with all children and young people on the autism spectrum is a difficulty in seeing the consequences in social and practical terms of one's own and others' actions and act appropriately. This we know is a problem with many children, or most children on the autism spectrum. This ability of cause and effect. If I do something, something will happen. But when you think about it, this is especially the case for women on the autism spectrum, because many of them are vulnerable to both verbal and sexual abuse in their attempt to fit into society, and therefore safety for females can be a major issue. I have a number of autistic friends who have written books and papers on exactly this issue, talking about how they misread social situations and end up getting themselves into difficulty. I'm not saying it's easy for boys. Nowadays, I think many boys and men are very vulnerable as well. But as I'm talking about women today, I'm just going to highlight that. Another thing Judith Gould has often found in her work, she says, even though some girls think this may be dangerous, they can't actually imagine how dangerous it will be, so they do it anyway, because they need to be accepted in a social situation, often outranks their need to be safe. So this is something we really need to think about. And in terms of education, we have put a lot of effort into this type of curriculum into our schools to help our children to be safe. Thank you. So let's look at diagnosis in terms of, diagnosis of women. We know that they have better imagination. We know that they have difficulty separating reality from fantasy. We know they'll often escape into fiction and live in another world. But we also know that they can't imagine risk, so they do it anyway. And I've put there a number of books that are quite interesting for young children, and the bottom one for slightly older children, which you might find useful. I know they're in English, unfortunately, but you probably have exactly the same sort of books, because that's the other thing we find, is that girls don't like to be told what to do, and girls don't like to be told that they're doing it wrong. So if you give them a book, they're more likely to read it, and they're more likely to follow the advice they get in a book, as opposed to the advice they get from myself as their teacher or you as their parent. Thank you. What I brought about this was just to show you some examples, and the top left-hand one is a quite interesting example of interests of girls and women, and many of us will relate to that fantastic array of shoes. But perfectionism is frequently seen in females, and they get angry and confused when things are not how they're supposed to be according to their learned rules. And why I'm mentioning that in particular is because they don't have that flexibility to adapt the rule that they learned to other things. And they are absolute perfectionists in terms of how they want it to be. So those are two key things to think about girls. And when it comes to depression, failure, and how they feel negative about themselves, it's often because they are perfectionists and somebody else has broken the rules. We have found that a lot of girls have become very angry in the United Kingdom during COVID, because there were people who broke the rules, who went out without wearing face coverings, etc. Okay, so you see this quite often, this rigid application of rules. And finally, unusual responses. No, that's okay, that's perfect. If you could move on, that's great, thank you. Next slide, thanks. And finally, the unusual responses to sensory input. So under or over reaction to sensory input is an important feature for all of our young people on the autism spectrum. And it's not so different in males or females. according to anecdotal or clinical accounts. Self-reporting regarding sensory issues is essential, as often parents are unable to provide this information. So we often get this from the people themselves. But when it comes to things like personal hygiene, puberty, etc., this is where girls really have a problem with their sensory issues that come with that. And there's a wonderful book written by Robin Stewart. I think I might have a picture of it coming up later. And she's recently written a really good book on how to deal with things like puberty and female hygiene issues if you're a woman on the autism spectrum. Thank you. A big thing that is coming up now all over Europe is understanding self and gender identity. This is a big issue with all people on the autism spectrum, but in particular, girls and women on the autism spectrum. Identity relates to self-image, self-esteem, and individuality. It's how you perceive yourself in relation to others. And from what I've been talking about already today, you will then realize how if these girls are perfectionists, they don't fit in, they try really hard to be the same as everybody else, but they're not. Can you imagine the negative thoughts that go on in their heads about being not that great? Their self-image goes down, their self-esteem goes down. And girls and women tend to internalize their problems, and therefore they often lose their whole personal identity. In the United Kingdom and many other places, we still have specialist schools where some children on the autism spectrum may go to. Interestingly enough, the girls who go to specialist schools are often in schools that are male-dominated. And we know that girls tend to learn from watching other girls. So often autistic girls have limited opportunity to do this if they are in a school that has predominantly boys. One of the schools I ran had 80 children and only 4 girls. And I remember one girl coming to me and said, I want to go to a girls' school because this is a boys' school. And I thought, she's absolutely right. She hasn't got other girls to learn from, because those 4 girls were all ranged between 5 years old and 20 years old. So we need to think about how to give opportunities for girls who are in specialist provisions that are male-dominated to have a chance to be with other girls. Gender identity in women and girls on the autism spectrum can be very confusing and adds to the difficulties in social interaction, and that needs to be teased out. We know that gender confusion in teenage girls is common, and currently there's much interest in research being carried out in this area. And Dr. Wen Lawson, who, as you know, has had similar issues himself, talks and speaks very, very openly about the issues of gender identity and autism. And this is an area that in a conference call I was in yesterday came up as one of the key issues that people are having to deal with in terms of autism currently. Okay. What we've found in our discussions that many women on the autism spectrum experience issues regarding gender identity, and that most girls at 11 have developed gender identity and start relating to girls and boys differently, but this may be delayed or non-existent for girls on the autism spectrum. And we talked about that earlier in terms of relating, communicating with adults and not having a social hierarchy. Gender identity and gender is also part of that. Zach says that some women with autism may also appear to have more male-like characteristics, which consequently may separate them from bonding with other females. And part of the reason for this might be simply things like some female clothing might be uncomfortable if you've got sensory issues. If you don't have peer pressure of social media telling you that you should dress a certain way, you might dress in a more comfortable way. There could be a lot of reasons for this. So self-esteem and identity are intrinsically linked, according to many female writers, which is why we need to get in at the age of 10, 11 years old and work on this, because it does have an impact on well-being and fostering mental health. Now, we know that the emotional instability and moodiness of adolescent girls can be amplified in girls with autism. We found that girls with autism can be at risk of reactive depression. And the reasons for that is they come to the realization that they're different from their peers, they're lacking acceptance from their peers, or they're being bullied, or the greater awareness of daily social difficulties they experience. And I know that sounds very negative, but by raising these, what we can think about is how do we get in when they're young to stop this happening? Because we don't want our young women with autism to be depressed, to have negative self-perception, to have feelings of worthlessness or hopelessness and self-harm as they get older. And we can do something about it when they're at school. And we've developed a lot of programs for this. Thank you. So here we're going to look at some of the things that we see in our girls. The future looks scary for them. They worry a lot. They're not able to switch off. They have a desperate fear of failure. They need to take control. They are feeling that they are not equipped to handle adult life. And they notice the gap between their intellectual abilities and what they can achieve on a day-to-day basis. So what we found is we've used an adapted form of behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, talking therapy, with our young children to identify the situations they find stressful, to help them identify how their bodies respond when they experience certain emotions, how to give them coping skills, how to relax. Those sort of things we can bring into the curriculum that really help our young women into having emotional well-being and good mental health. Thank you. One of the most unhappy things our girls will talk about is bullying. And boys get bullied and girls get bullied, but boys get bullied in a different way for girls. You know, boys, it's more aggressive, you can see it, but girls, it's very subtle. They threaten, they name, tease. It includes social intimidation. Often our girls don't realize they're being bullied because it is so subtle. And when they do realize it, it's like a double upset for them because they feel stupid and they feel bullied. The sad thing is that it appears that the impact, boys are more likely to get bullied than girls, but the emotional impact of being bullied is worse for girls than boys. So what we tend to do at schools now is teach children how to react to bullying. We use role play, which is something that girls find very comfortable. They love role play, so this is a natural thing for them. We use videos to analyze bullying. What was this person saying? What were they saying? Girls love doing that. And then we teach them the correct way to respond to bullying and to play. And this is how we try and alleviate their social anxiety, because they experience more social anxiety. So we've got to find ways of giving them the skills to deal with that social anxiety. But the impact of bullying and the types of bullying of girls is a very, very damaging issue. And the impact of it can actually come out in many, many ways. And one of the ways it can come out is eating issues. Many young children on the autism spectrum, as we know, have issues with food. But parents of girls on the autism spectrum have reported the following, and this is why it should be part of the curriculum at school. And we'll look at things like confusing hunger and nausea, always feeling hungry, drinks excessively, etc., but a rigid and restricted eating pattern. And they found that 18 to 23% of adolescent girls diagnosed with anorexia also present with signs of so-called Asperger's syndrome. So basically, what Gilbert is saying is that a large number of girls who get diagnosed with anorexia actually have an autism spectrum condition. And it's interesting because the anorexia that is shown by autistic girls is often about control. So let's move on to the society pressure that all of our people are under in society. We know that there's a lack of identification. We know that people are stigmatized. We know that sometimes they call this is a mild form of autism, which is a complete misnomer. We know that girls and women tend to experience all of these issues and society's pressures far more than men. And that hasn't changed. And it's interesting, somebody has just written a book about the double glass ceiling in terms of women on the autism spectrum and careers. So we need to think about that when these young children are young. And one of the problems is that there's inflexibility in the application of social rules, which narrows their opportunities, and difficulty in finding the appropriate help and understanding. Okay. Women are affected by autism in the same way as their male counterparts. However, according to a woman with autism, they are doubly challenged by the added assumptions that society places on their female gender. So, for example, problems related to the autism spectrum are combined with society's expectations of women, how one looks, what one wears, how you're supposed to relate socially, that a woman is supposed to have natural empathy for others. They want to have children, they want to have relationships. All of these things may not always apply to every single person on the autism spectrum, just as they don't apply to every woman that isn't on the autism spectrum. But girls and women often feel this great pressure to comply. Thank you. Many women also state that it's difficult being a minority within a unique group of society. So, having an autism spectrum condition is a unique little group in society, not such a little group, quite a big group, but a group in society, and they are a minority within that group. And they also say that they have very few opportunities to make friendships with other women. And this really impacts on their lives. Thank you. So, what we find is cultural expectations have an issue. And here are a couple of quotations that actually allude to this. For example, an attractive appearance for a young woman in our society is linked to intelligence, kindness, and overall influence. Yet young women with ASD may be ambivalent about appearance. As I said earlier, they might dress for comfort as opposed to looking good. And then Temple Grandin said, men and women are judged differently when it comes to appearance. Men who appear grungy, archaic in their fashion sense, or just eccentric, are usually excused for this shortcoming. But a gungy, unkept or strange woman is a spectacle. She says women on the spectrum who do not conform are viewed as childish, disorderly or rebellious and not accorded respect or taken seriously. And that's a woman on the autism spectrum talking about her experience. So we need to think about this because she is not the only person. There are many, many people who speak like this. Thank you. So what we need to do is equip our girls and women with the knowledge and the confidence to choose the path that's right for them. We need to tell them that it's okay if they do or do not want to be part of typical culture and its requirements. There are clear rules about what women need in the way of relationships that's pretty clearly communicated in our culture, and these rules should not be applied to girls with the autism spectrum. And it's interesting that girls, more so than boys, are often bombarded with the idea that being more social and being a better person are the same thing. So there's this mixture of, because you're sociable and kind, you're a good person. So what if you're not sociable? Does that make you not a good person? Well, we know that's rubbish. So we need to get these messages across to our girls on the spectrum. And we need to help them find people with shared interests, because this is where it's all important. This is where the relationships start. And Mikkel Miwaya said, you don't find love by being a fake. You find love by living and being the best version of you that you can achieve. And this is what a lot of young girls on the autism spectrum need to know, that they are a valuable person in their own right, and to find people with similar interests, because all of us have relationships with people whose interests we share. Thank you. So, we know there are difficulties at the moment about the current diagnosis of girls and women. The international diagnostic criteria do not give examples of behaviours experienced by women and girls. And therefore, a wider perspective on gender roles is needed regarding social, communication, imagination dimensions, in addition to special interests and rigidity of behaviours. And what we need to do as clinicians is the right questions need to be asked, as often the person has adopted a social role based on intellect rather than social intuition. And that's according to Dr. Judith Gould, who, as you know, is extremely experienced in the diagnosis of women and girls on the autism spectrum. And she feels there's a need for this to change. And she herself is working on it currently. Okay. Next slide. Thanks.
Yes, it is. Sorry, Dr. Eштон Смит, may I ask you to speed up, because you're talking more than 1 hour. I know that you have 11 slides more, but
I can speak fast.
Faster, yeah, please speak faster.
We can flick past this one. Go past this one. Okay, next slide. Okay, can we go on to the next slide? Thank you. I wanted to bring up the fact that the DISCO, the Diagnostic Interview for Social and Communication Disorders, is being revamped at the moment and updated. And the DISCO is being updated to have now examples of behaviors that we need to pick up in girls and women. Okay, so if you can flick past that now, thank you. Okay, next one. Next slide, great. So I'm going to end on this slide because the importance of diagnosis of the autism spectrum. It's important because a diagnosis is not a label, but a guide as to how to help and support the child, taking into account of their strengths and difficulties. And the diagnosis is the starting point to explain how to help children. And I think that's really important, that we know that a diagnosis is not meant to be a label, but is meant to be a pathway to help a young person. And that's particularly important for girls and women on the autism spectrum. Okay. Next one. Okay, and right, the last slide. Thank you. I'm flicking through these last slides because you can read them yourself at your leisure, or if you ever have any leisure. Okay, and last one. Thank you. Okay, next one. Okay. Okay, last word. I think it's interesting. This is written by a woman with Asperger's syndrome, and I will finish on this slide. The autism spectrum is vast and beautifully complex. Some individuals are easily identified, but for others, their autism is a prism. It is present, but yet it remains transparent until the appropriately trained clinician shines their knowledge and light onto it. And only then can the colors and the complexities be seen and understood. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm sorry I've gone over time. I do apologize.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eштон Смит. It's no problem. I appreciate your energy and willingness to talk. You talk almost 65 minutes, but I hope that our audience will be very satisfied. We have around 55 participants. Instead, 176 were fulfilled Google form for attendance, but okay, probably some of them were busy. Thank you very much for this very inspired, very inspired presentation about the girls and women who have autism. As we knew, and as you mentioned in your presentation, the epidemiology is of autism spectrum disorders is 4 boys and on 1 girl, and girls probably are underestimated, and they're covered with other diagnoses, as you already mentioned. I think that your presentation was very useful for our parents in Macedonia and for our students and younger colleagues, because in our handbooks there is not so much literature for women and girls in autism spectrum, and that's why I think that your presentation was very useful. Now I'm opening the second session. Questions, remarks, and answers, your answers. And please, if you have a question, you can write it down in the chat, or you can, okay, we already have some questions in the chat. I will read them for you. Vlasta Šuštaršić, she is a postgraduate student from University in Slovenia, alma mater Europea University. It was really privilege listening to that. Thank you. It's only the constatation. Now, Irena Stojanovska II, our postgraduate student of Institute of Special Education and Rehabilitation here in Skopje, Macedonia. Is the different presentation of autism mainly seen in girls with less severe autism, or does it also affect girls on the lower end of the spectrum? The second one from her, how does it present in these girls, bearing in mind their strongly impaired intellectual, social functioning and behavior? Please, Џеки.
Thank you for the question. Yes, it actually affects girls at all ends of the spectrum, but you probably won't notice it as much with the girls with severe learning disabilities, as much as you will notice it. So the girls who if you look at ordinary children on the autism spectrum, be they boys or girls, they have less opportunities to socialize, to live independently, to practice all of those social skills if they are on the less able end of the spectrum. But the girls still there feel the need to be part of society, part of what's going on, more so than boys of the same intellectual level, but you probably won't notice it as much. So what a lot of parents will do is set up little friendship groups with their daughter, even their daughters with profound learning disabilities. So they've just got one person to play with, because that's important for these little girls. But yes, it's all of our girls will show that to a lesser or greater extent.
Okay, I hope that our postgraduate student is satisfied with your answer. You was very comprehensive, and also very in your presentation you explain almost all aspects of girls and women who have autism spectrum disorders. Now we have 2 questions. Probably they will join us with audio, and I give permission to our student Anna Markovska. She's a student of Institute of Psychology. Okay, go on. And the other one is from second one. I will give permission also to her. Go on, Markovska.
Thanks so much for this amazing presentation. I'd like to ask, can some traumas experienced in the so-called critique period of childhood, especially some unhealthy father-daughter relations, contribute to the development of autism spectrum disorders in girls? Thanks so much in advance.
Thank you too. Please.
And it's not an area I know much about, to be honest. I have not experienced or worked in the field of trauma with daughters and fathers. But what I can do is try and find out for you, because I know some people who have worked in that field. If you send me your email, I will try and find out more information on that for you from people I know who are experienced in that field.
Okay, thanks. I will give her email when she will ask to me. Okay, we are going to the next question. Obviously, your presentation was very inspiring, and we have a lot of questions and a lot of comments. Nada Dupjačanec-Nikolovska, I give you the permission for audio and video. She is our postgraduate student, and I'm her mentor as well for Irena Stojanovska. First question. Okay, Nada, please go on with camera and with your video if you like. I give you the permission. You raise your hand. I hope that you have a question, because we have to close to this webinar. Please give the question, or I should check the chat. There is one more question in the chat. Would you please address the issue of how to help these girls once they are recognized?
Yes.
I don't know. This is some guest with short name, and I could not recognize. Probably in the future, I will not read the question from anonymous persons.
Okay. Yes, definitely. I mean, that's the reason why we identify these girls, and we've developed what we call the hidden curriculum, which we've introduced into a lot of schools, which directly address the particular issues that girls have, and we teach them scientifically to deal with the social communication and social imagination issues that they have. And it's amazing the difference that it makes to young girls' lives to be able to be identified when they're young and to have the support systems put in place. So yes, definitely, without a doubt, we can do a huge amount to support our girls. The earlier we diagnose them, the better.
Okay.
And one of my colleagues, Chris Walvin, is sitting there hiding in there. Now, this gentleman actually works with, has worked comprehensively with adults on the autism spectrum. And what we found that since we've put in the programs for girls and young women from an early age, around about 15 years ago, we find that the impact on the adult experience is quite obvious by my colleagues who work in adult services, that the outcomes for them is so much more positive.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ashton Smit. Another question comes from Slovenia. My postgraduate student, Andrea Vidergar Trebušak, asks and says, thank you for a very good and useful presentation. Maybe do you have any experience about girls with intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorders?
Yes, yes. In the 40 years that I've worked in this field, I've worked with children at the widest range of the spectrum. So from girls with profound learning disabilities to girls who are on the so-called gifted end of the intellectual ability. So yes, and all of the girls can be supported and helped to achieve their full potential if they get the right interventions at the right times. So yes, there are a lot of young girls out there that can do with our help.
Okay, thank you very much. We are going on the next one from Nada Dupjačanec-Nikolovska. Probably she has some troubles with microphone or camera. Do you think that diagnostic tools are mainly male gender oriented?
Yes, very much so. And it's interesting because there's been a lot of work on that recently, that the diagnostic criteria that we use are based on the male stereotype within a Western culture. And what we're finding is that a lot of the diagnostic tools that we use are not just picking up girls and women on the autism spectrum, but are also not picking up children from other cultures. And so a lot of work is being done on this at the moment. There's a book that's been written by a Dr. Prithvi Pareppa here in London on this particular subject, which people might find interesting in terms of the issues we are finding in Europe with people coming into Europe, which I think is important. But taking your point about girls and women, the criteria are definitely male gender orientated, and the DISCO is looking at that, and the revised DISCO that'll come out later on this year, excuse me, has now got exemplars that will pick up women for the first time.
That's it. Okay. One more of our students of Faculty of Philosophy, Alexander Bucevski. He's, I think, on the Institute of Psychology. I gave him permission for microphone and camera. Please go on, Alexander.
Thank you, Professor. It was a very pleasant presentation. And I'm curious about how we can distinct the introvert girls on probably on younger age from the ones that have the autistic spectrum of disorder, because quite sometimes there is a possibility that some introvert girls share the most common symptoms of autistic spectrum of disorder.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there, and it's difficult to tease it out, isn't it? And the one thing I find, and this is difficult, is that the girls who are introvert have an intrinsic or intuitive social understanding. It comes naturally to them. They don't have to learn it. and yet they're still introverted. The introverted girls on the autism spectrum are learning it in a non-intuitive way. And that is the subtle difference. The one is learnt and the other is intuitive. And you've got to try and tease out this, and you only pick up the difference because of subtleties. They're very subtle things that you would pick out the difference, and you get to know these children very well, and you'll start seeing the one child has social instinct, but they are introverted, and the other girl is introverted because they are lacking social instinct and are trying to learn it in a scientific way as opposed to an intuitive way. Does that help a bit?
Yes, thank you very much.
All I'm doing is making your life very difficult, because that is a very, very subtle thing. And when you work with children, you've got to really get to know them. And what we find often is this is where you have to be in complete partnership with the parents to really get to know that child under their skin, to pick up those subtleties, because the girls are very good at pretending and masking.
Excuse me, Professor, just one more sentence. I guess the skill to distinct the introvert from the autistic spectrum of disorder comes with experience.
Absolutely. And isn't that the case? We can all learn so much through books, but we always learn from the people that we work with. And this is the big thing. I think it's the experience. And that's why people like Dr. Judith Gould, etc., who have been clinicians, diagnosticians now for, 20, 30 years working hands-on, they pick up the things that somebody without that experience may not do it. So, yeah, definitely. Autism is complex, and it takes time to get to know these very, very interesting, complex people and get under their skin. Yeah, it's not something you can just learn from a book.
Yes. Yeah, the colleague Alexander Bucevsky is a young student, and I think that during his studies he will learn much more about autism. And you're absolutely right; it's very complex, and
yeah,
you need 40 years, 30 years working.
I remember Lorna Wing once said to me, she said if she had to rate herself 1 to 10 on her knowledge of autism, and that's the most experienced person in the world, she said she'd have put herself at a 3, because she says the more you learn, the less you know.
Yes, and she has wonderful mind in autism field. I think one of the leaders got rest her in peace. Okay. We have 2 more questions, and we should close today's webinar. I am very, very satisfied with your presentation and with the interest of our audience, with our postgraduate students, for graduation students, and also probably some parents. This webinar is also presenting on the live streaming on our YouTube channel, and a lot of people who were on their workplaces can watch offline after we will finished. Nada Dupjačanec also have a constatation or question. The girls are masking their behavior using if and then system of interacting with peers.
I don't quite understand that. What I think, Nadia, what I think you're asking is, are girls masking their behavior using IT, information systems, social media? Because yes, they do.
Yeah. Probably it's typing error. Here is writing if, but probably she means That's why I am asking our audience to give the questions in live with the questions, because there is some typing error.
Nada, that's a very important question, because this is one of our biggest issues in the current world is social media. The girls are copying what's happening in social media. They are copying people like the Kardashians, etc., etc., etc. Where they used to sometimes meet ordinary people, they now meet online only people who have been painted out, or, you know, made out all pretty and perfect, etc., etc. So what is happening is that the girls are copying this behavior. They're masking their own selves a lot more, but they're often they're more unhappy with themselves because they don't fit what social media says is perfect, because we know that it's all a big lie, and that a lot of the girls that we see on social media are not as perfect as they're portrayed to be. They also think that their lives are terrible because everybody else is having such a wonderful life, but they don't realize that half the people who are saying they're having a wonderful life are having just as boring a life as they are. And so social media has become a very big tool that's making these girls feel worse and worse about themselves. So I'm glad you brought that up, Nada, because that's something we really need to look at in terms of mental health and emotional well-being with our girls. Oh, and another thing, Nada, just quickly, girls are more likely to give information on social media than boys because they don't have the subtleties of understanding that the person who's asking the questions might not be a decent person or who they pretend they are. And girls are more likely than boys to share information that they shouldn't, which is a worry.
I absolutely agree about the phenomenon of Kardashians with you. And I think there is one more comment from the colleague. I think this colleague, I don't know him or her personally, Chris Wolvin, probably he's your guest, he or she is your guest. Thank you, Џеки. Excellent insight into an area of autism neglected in the past. It's only a comment, and if you have something to add, please, or I will go to close the webinar with a few sentences.
Yeah, just like to.
Okay, Chris Wolvin is raising the hand. I will give the permission for probably wants to talk, and okay, I want to meet.
He can be your next. He can be your next speaker.
Can be a man or woman. I don't know. Sorry, Christian.
Chris,
okay?
you can speak.
You can speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, it's a man. I think.
Sorry to disappoint, Vladimir.
No, you don't disappoint me.
Yeah, no, excellent, Đeki. Wonderful insight to an area that I think has been neglected in the past. Like I say, in my experience over the years, a lot of there would have been young women who missed out on the proper diagnosis at the time, were presented as having other underlying or overlying mental health issues, such as personality disorders, or even schizophrenia, usually around the emotional behavioral types. And again, that was due to lack of being signposted to the right diagnostic clinicians, and you know, and I think it's really good that we're actually highlighting it now. So there wasn't a question in there, but just to sort of like to reiterate what you'd said.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. Chris has worked for at least 30 years in the field of autism and mental health. And this is an area that's been very much, well, Chris has always been a leading light in the field of autism and mental health. So thank you very much for saying that, Chris. I appreciate it with your background. Thank you.
Are you from London, Chris?
From the Midlands.
Midlands.
Yeah, right in the middle of the country.
Maybe we can invite you to share your knowledge.
He would be brilliant.
Webinars, if you like it.
Yeah.
we don't know each other personally, but now I'm using this opportunity to invite you. Please send me your email, or Џеки can send me your email, and I will invite you for May, June, or after the summer. Also, I want to say to all of you that Џеки was so kind, and she also said me when we have 50 minutes meeting or 20 before this webinar, and she also expressed her willingness to give another webinar in the summertime or after the summertime in September or October. Okay, thank you for your comments, Chris, and now I will go to close this webinar. I think it's enough. Yeah, around 100 minutes. It's enough for today. Thank you again, Џеки, and also I want to take to my collaborators, our Vice President, Ivana Vasilevska-Petrovska, who is Master of Science in Autism field, and she was responsible for live streaming on YouTube. To our secretary, Vesna Filipovska, she was responsible for our chat, and little bit to our Emilia Tramperska, who made some photos and sent few of our social media in the chat, and also Ivana as well. And I hope we have around 55 participants. Also, I'm very grateful to Chris. Probably you invite him, and every of our guests has a right to invite his or her guests on the next webinars. Okay, now I want to wish to all of you a lot of health, to stay safe and healthy in the following period. Coronavirus is still around us. In Macedonia, there is decreasing in the numbers, but there is still no ending of pandemic and epidemics. So I invite all of your attendees today, and also you, if you like, Џеки, for the next webinar. It's on the 31st of March, 6 p.m. Central European Time. Our next guest will be from the USA. There is also poster, and there is, you will see the details in next 2 weeks. And I hope that it will be also very useful and very practical webinar with a lot of information about our parents of children with autism, and our postgraduate students and undergraduate students on our University St. Cyril and Methodius here in Skopje. So now it's time to say bye to all of you. Take care and keep in touch, and see you on our next webinars, and probably with you, Џеки, on the summer or after the summer in September.
Great.
Okay.
You take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much. Keep in touch in our projects, or
yeah, we'll do.
We will invite you after this webinar to write for our journal, if you like, Journal for Touch Therapy and Developmental Diversities. Our secretary, Andrea, will send you invitation letters. Okay, okay.
Look after yourself.
Bye.
Stay safe, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.
Stay safe, all of you. Bye-bye.